a number of questions need to be raised that were never raised in junior high when you studied it. What is a civil war? Genuine question. What is a civil war? Janet, when various segments of Yugoslavia attempted to leave the Federation, there were several wars, weren't there? Would you consider those civil wars?
If it's not instigated from the outside, if it's just completely...
You're rightly pointing at one of the factors in terms of distinguishing. The several wars in Yugoslavia, they were all instigated in one fashion or another by the West, intending to break up the Federation of Yugoslavia. And that is certainly pertinent, but okay, let's ask the question a little bit different. What about Ukraine?
Would you say that would still be a civil war? Would you consider it a civil war?
You're asking me to give the answer before I check you through that.
Go ahead.
But by definition, quite seriously, and we'll talk for a few minutes about these examples, a civil war is where two or more groups are attempting to establish sovereignty, establish dominion over the territory. The conflict in Russia from 1918 to 1921 was a true civil war, even though foreigners were in fact involved. The United States invaded Russia up at the north about 1920. So there were foreigners involved, but it was a genuine civil war because you had the monarchists, the whites, and the reds all fighting not to escape, but to take control of the central government. That was a true civil war. When Chiang Kai-shek was fighting Mao Zedong in China, it was a true civil war because the nationalists wanted to control the state and the communists wanted to control the state. Some other examples, Spain, and I think it was 1935, but if I'm wrong by a couple of years, forgive me. Spain was a true civil war. You had two groups intending to take control of the national government. A civil war is where you have two or more groups that want to take control of the whole shebang. Ukraine in 2014, Donetsk and the Lugansk wanted to establish separate sovereignty for their areas of southeastern Ukraine because they recognized the profound anti-Russian feeling of the rest of the Ukraine. And the southeast portion of Ukraine is inhabited almost exclusively by Russians, by people who are ethnically Russian. As Crimea, which successfully extricated itself from Ukraine and was accepted back into the Federation, the Russian Federation, is about 97% ethnically Russian. They were not trying to take over the central government, they just wanted out. And Donetsk and Lugansk are still being shelled by both the Ukrainian government forces and the neo-Nazi forces who want the land, and like some other people, for example in Palestine, the Ukrainians want the land of Donetsk and Lugansk, but they don't want the Russians there. Well, they talked about Yugoslavia. The United States, 1861 to 65, was not a civil war. Why? Because the southern states were not trying to take over the central government. They simply were attempting to exercise what they and everyone else in 1860, almost everyone else, in 1861 was their legitimate right. They had entered voluntarily into the Federation of Sovereign States, and as sovereign states, they felt they had the right to secede. The movie 1776 was made about 1972 or 3. And there were two segments of it. It's a musical. There were two segments of it that were not included in the DVD or the VHS version of it. And it's kind of politically interesting why they weren't. One part of the movie that was not included in the commercial version depicted the plutocrats, especially of Pennsylvania, leading the rest of the very wealthy in the Congress in a minuet that was rejoicing their wealth and power. And Richard Nixon thought it was not appropriate to include that in the version that the public saw. The other describes what the Southerners intended the Federation of Sovereign States to be.
Please do go on, gentlemen. You're making the only breeze in Philadelphia.
Mr. Adams, perhaps you could clear up something for me? After we have achieved independence, who do you propose would govern in South Carolina?
The people, of course.
Which people, sir? The people of South Carolina or the people of Massachusetts?
Now, why don't you admit it, Nettie? You're against independence now, and you always will be.
Gentlemen, you refuse to understand us. We desire independence. Yes. For South Carolina, that is our country. As such, we don't wish it to belong to anyone. Not to England. Not to you.
We intend to have one nation, Rutledge.
A nation of sovereign states, Mr. Adams. United for our mutual protection, but separate for our individual pursuits. Now, that is what we have understood it to be. And that is what we will support. As soon as everyone supports it.
A nation of sovereign states, a federation of sovereign states. That is one of at least two different visions of what the United States was to become. The other one, which was held by some and perhaps many of the colonial leadership, was one national power from sea to shining sea, spanning the continent from Atlantic to Pacific, and George Washington and a number of others are known to have held this image of the United States. Shelby Foote describes it very nicely when he asserts that to understand the United States as we are today, the student has to reckon very seriously with the impact of the so-called Civil War on the people and on the states and the central government.
Any understanding of this nation has to be based, and I mean really based, on an understanding of the Civil War. I believe that firmly. It defined us. The Revolution did what it did. Our involvement in European wars, beginning with the First World War, did what it did. But the Civil War defined us as what we are, and it opened us to being what we became, good and bad things. And it is very necessary, if you're going to understand the American character in the 20th century, to learn about this enormous catastrophe of the mid-19th century. It was the crossroads of our being, and it was a hell of a crossroads.
Shelby Foote passed away about 12 years ago, and in my opinion, he probably was one of the best historians of the War of Northern Aggression that we had. So, going back to the Socratic method, you get a chance to participate. Why do national leaders go to war? Now, we all know, or I think we all know, that the people go to war because they're told to go to war. They're told that they're being, Hermann Goering said that you tell the people that you're being attacked, you attack the people who don't want to go to war as unpatriotic, and you tell them that the enemy is the absolute evil, And of course they don't want to go to war, but they go to war because they are rallied around this imago of patriotism. They have nothing to gain from it. They have a leg or arm or an eye or a life to lose from it. They have absolutely nothing to gain. We have to ask the question, why do national states go to war? Now obviously, go ahead Janet, please.
I think of Marie Antoinette and let them, people are going in the streets demanding, bread and all this. And so what did they do? They started a foreign war, so it takes people's attention off their own needs and makes them do what the leaders want them to do.
Okay, it can be a diversion from local stresses, get people's attention pointed elsewhere rather than at home. And you might say that Grenada was one of those examples. It wasn't much of a war, but it certainly got the people's attention off domestic affairs. Another reason is to sell military armaments. If you look at World War I, the American people had zero to gain from entering that damned war. They had absolutely nothing to gain and a lot to lose. However, the financiers, the banking industry of the United States, had a great deal to gain. They were in the process of lending substantial amounts of money to Britain and France, and they wanted to continue and they wanted to guarantee the return on those investments. The armaments industry had a great deal to gain from it because they needed to sustain the war, they needed to keep the war going in order to continue selling armaments. Now you see the same thing going in American history nowadays because the military-industrial complex of the United States is probably the only genuinely productive industry that is selling overseas. Now I'm sure to be challenged on that, and I will fully admit that the United States is doing some very creative things in other areas. But there's absolutely no doubt as to who the primary seller of military equipment is in the world today. None whatsoever. So making money by selling armaments, defense, real or imagined. Janet mentioned an imagined one or a real one. For example, the South clearly went to war because they were defending themselves. We can get into the details of that in a moment, but they were invaded at the first battle of Bull Run. So they fought back, quite legitimately. If we look at Great Britain, they got into wars in a variety of places in order to expand their colonial empire. By conquering India, they conquered a market. They could buy cheap and sell expensively. They could buy Indian cotton inexpensively, and they could sell finished cotton goods with a substantial markup back to the Indians. In the movie Gandhi, he talks about depriving the British of the Indian clothing market, and if the last thing you have is a single loincloth, homespun, wear it with dignity. So colonial expansion, and frankly this applies a great deal to post-World War II United States, has a great deal to do with guaranteeing markets and guaranteeing cheap raw materials. To gain territory, the area of Alsace-Lorraine that straddles what is traditionally known as France and Germany has been traded back and forth between the two nation states something like 5 times in 3 centuries, because both countries want the fertile land, farmland of the Alsace-Lorraine. In fact, a book that a friend of mine recently pointed me to is written by a gentleman who grew up in Alsace-Lorraine, which means he had French as well as German heritage, and he was fighting on the Eastern Front, so he was fighting Russians. And he wrote the book, The Forgotten Soldier, and my friend commended it to me because it's one of the few books that he had read that was written by someone on the losing side. A very important perspective to gain, and I've only looked at a portion of it, but you can download it. It's free in PDF form on the internet, and it's not a novel, it simply is a factual account of a grunt who successfully survived the Eastern Front. Pride. Often used to rally the common man to defend your territory, to express A, B, C, D, or ideology. It's almost certainly not in the 20th or 21st century a commonly employed motivation. But in the 19th and 18th century, when fighting was done by professional soldiers and there was a policy of relative civility between the troops, pride may well have been a significant factor. Ideology. I seriously doubt if Urban II wanted to go to war with the Saracens, with the Muslims of Palestine. But he had already been rejected as the sole leader of the Christian church in 1056. The Orthodox had said, we're not going to recognize the papacy as the supreme head. We think that the church is governed by the collection of bishops, all of whom have equal significance and equal authority. So Urban had a political motivation, but he also had an ideology. He could enhance his political position within the church by fostering a crusade against the infidel and thus reinforce his position, what he claimed, as the sole leadership of the Christian church. So ideology can sometimes be a real factor, and it is very frequently used as a propaganda factor. I'm going to show you a clip that is entitled The Cause of the Civil War, Episode 99. I'm describing it in detail because I commend it to you. I would like you to see the full 60-minute video at your convenience, which is downloaded. But, and this is an important caveat in my opinion, the author of the video makes a mistake in what he says is the primary cause of the Civil War. And the reason I'm calling attention to the effect is that he is so close to the real cause of the Civil War that he doesn't see it. It's like when you are standing very close to something that is transparent, for example, a screen door. You never see the screen mesh. You see what is beyond it. The author of this video sees a very important factor that conditioned the events of the Civil War, but we'll get into what I think was actually behind it. This is the clip.
Well, let's call a thing what it is. So let's look at this final issue. What, in fact, was at the bottom of the cause of the Civil War, if not slavery? Now, I put forward to you that the bottom, the underpinning cause of the Civil War was racism. Plain and simple, white racism. It was a racism that had no borderline, equally invasive, infecting the minds of the white men north of the Mason-Dixon line as well as white men south of the Mason-Dixon line. It was a universal racism among white men in America. That's a bold statement. So to support that statement, I will quote three great senators who spoke on the Senate floor. The first is Henry Clay, renowned as possibly the greatest senator of all time, speaking on the Senate floor on February 7th, 1839. At a time, the Senate was being inundated with petitions from abolition groups to somehow use the words and phrases in the Constitution as an excuse to abolish slavery. The second senator is Daniel Webster, speaking on March 7, 1850, followed 5 days later by William Seward, senator from New York. At the time, the leading Republican of this new nascent party fielding its first presidential candidate in 1856. So let's start with Henry Clay and see if we can find in his words a grasp of this core infection that constitutes the real objective human cause of the American Civil War. Quote, "The point of attack the abolitionists are making is the institution of domestic slavery as it exists in those states. It is to liberate 3 million slaves held in bondage within them. Let's look at the insurmountable obstacles. The first obstacle is an absolute want of all power on the part of the general government to effect that purpose. The Constitution creates a limited government, leaving the residual mass of political power in the possession of the several states. The Constitution could never have been formed upon the principle of investing the general government with the power to abolish slavery at its pleasure. It never could be continued a single day if the exercise of such power be assumed or usurped. The slavery is our affair, not theirs. Why not leave it to us as the common constitution of our country has left it? The second obstacle arises from the fact of the presence of 3 million slaves. They are there, part and parcel of our population. The slaves are here and must remain in some condition. What is to be done with them? In the slave states, the alternative is that the white must govern the black, or the black govern the white. In several of the states, blacks outnumber the whites. Abolition would immediately be followed by a war of extermination. This is our true ground to defense for the continued existence of slavery in our country," unquote. That was Henry Clay on the floor of the Senate. A war of extermination between the white population and the black population for control of government. But Clay goes on, quote, "The third obstacle is to be found in the immense amount of capital which is invested in the slave property. The average value of a slave now has $500. The total value then is 1,200 millions. It is proposed by these abolitionists by a single fiat of legislation to annihilate this immense amount of property, to annihilate it without indemnity and without compensation to the owners. Does any reasonable person believe it possible to effect such an object without convulsion, a revolution, and of bloodshed?" Unquote. Now, folks, even in our time, putting ourselves in the shoes of these people as they lived in 1839, these three obstacles we can see are real and substantial. But why are they real and why are they substantial? That's an incredibly important question. Why can't they be accommodated, extinguished, pacified? What is preventing that from happening? Well, Henry Clay goes on, quote, "This is not all. The abolitionists oppose all separation of the races. They would keep the two races pent up together within the same limits, perpetuating their animosities and constantly endangering the peace of the community. They proclaim that color is nothing, that the organic," there's that word again, "and characteristic differences between the two races ought to be discarded, in that we ought to take the blacks into our bosom on the same footing of equal social condition. Such would be an unnatural amalgamation. Who is to begin it? Is it their purpose to not only create a competition? Now, this is the core. Think about it. Competition between black labor and white labor? Do they intend to contaminate the laboring classes at the North by a revolving admixture of the black element? Unquote. Now, think about these men in terms of the leadership. They are a handful of men, but they are leaders. They are all Republicans now. Some used to be Democrats, some used to be Whigs. This is the Thaddeus Stevens, the Charles Sumners, and the John Bingham of Ohio types. Think about all that. At this time and in the coming decades, millions of Irish people, as destitute as any African slave, are emigrating from the oppression of Ireland under the British rule and ending up in Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri. Germans are fleeing religious persecution at the same time in the millions and coming up the Mississippi River into that exact same area. Millions and millions of white immigrants. Now, do these people, mostly laborers, want to be in competition with free black men? Can we not understand the black man is going to undercut the wages of the white man? That sounds terribly racist today. But it was the reality in the streets of the pre-war North. This is how people thought then. Quote, abolition will unite one side against the other. Union on one side will beget union on the other, and that consolidation will be attended with all the violent prejudices and bitter passions and implacable animosities which ever degraded human nature. A virtual dissolution of the Union will have taken place while the forms of its existence remain. One section will stand in menacing and hostile array against the other. The collision of opinion will be quickly followed by force of arms. The abolitionists should not flatter themselves that having consolidated the North against the South, they will enter the contest with superior numbers that will ensure victory. But if they conquer, who will they conquer? Unquote. So there's a speech that tells you the mood of the country. The idea that the white people of the North, whatever this little group of radical abolitionists, their wish to convince them what to do, want nothing to do with free black people in their communities. In their communities. They want nothing to do with them.
I really do commend that to you because he does a very, very good job. On third viewing, I am impressed with the number of arguments that he makes that are virtually identical to the arguments that the Israelis make, or the Israeli establishment makes, about making peace with the Palestinians. And yet, I will tell you that the so-called hostility that this speaker speaks of is totally politically and economically derived. That is, the blacks had very little hostility for the whites who were not lashing them or raping their wives or exploiting them and selling them on the slave market. There was no intrinsic hatred of the black on the white. And no more than there is intrinsic hatred of Israeli Jew on the part of the Palestinian Arab. It ain't there. But it does make an interesting political argument. Where this speaker ignores certain evidence, however, is that in terms of other nation states that had employed slavery, there was no lack of prejudice amongst them. Now, he is right that who should pay for the liberation of those slaves is a very legitimate question. And in some cases, other nation states provided out of the central cookie jar, central treasury, compensation for the owner of the slave. On the other hand, who benefited economically from the ownership of that slave? Obviously, the slave owner. What happened to a great many liberated slaves after the Civil War? They became sharecroppers in the South. They didn't start moving north until several decades later. So, for two other reasons, slavery was going to end in the next few decades. First, because it was becoming economically unprofitable. The slave owner, especially the small slave owner, had to provide for the elderly and the children, and sometimes the women of his slaves, because the women needed to be around to at least sometimes take care of the children. So you're talking about 1.5 useful workers, surprisingly unmotivated, to support 3 human beings. So from an economic point of view, slavery was ending. From a sociologic point of view, every Southern woman whose husband owned slaves was getting sick and tired of black women bearing half brown, half white children that looked amazingly like their husbands. They were on the point of a social revolt against their own husbands for just that reason. So slavery was destined to end in the next several decades, regardless of what the federal government did. In the same production, the author of this production admits that Lincoln's arguments for the perpetuity of the Federation, because he made several arguments on the floor of the combined House and Senate, his arguments have more holes in it than a sieve. Lincoln was very clever in tricking South Carolina into firing on Fort Sumter. Now, the reports of how it was done vary in 2 or 3 significant elements. But the reality of the fact is that in terms of violence, the South was the first one to employ violence in defense of its sovereignty. The firing on Fort Sumter in the Charleston, South Carolina harbor. I'm going to draw a very close parallel because just as Franklin Delano Roosevelt created the conditions for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which was no surprise to FDR, he created the conditions where they had little choice but to attack Pearl Harbor. Lincoln created the conditions where the Charleston militia had to fire on Fort Sumter. But the question is not only did they have to fire on it, but why did Lincoln create those conditions? Lincoln never addresses the question as to why the Northerners don't simply allow secession. Let's consider the North American continent in the middle of the 19th century. The Mexican cession had been yielded to the federal government. Take note of that. It was yielded to the federal government in 1848. That goes up to the border between Oregon and California, across Nevada, across Utah, over to the borders of the Louisiana Purchase. It follows the Rio Grande River down and then across back over to Baja California. So the Southerners were not going to go westward. They had no territory to seize there unless they wanted to go to war with the federal government that already possessed that area. the Louisiana Purchase had been made by the Federation, the United States Federation, and the slogan 5440 or fight was a campaign slogan 16 years before Lincoln was elected. So the northern boundary of the Federation of the United States had been established well before the firing on Fort Sumter. The Confederacy of the United States was not going anywhere. The Transcontinental Railroad was in the process of being planned to connect Illinois to California, both of which were already states. One route was planned to go through Missouri, another route was planned to go through Iowa. Missouri was a slave state, Iowa was a free state. So the point that I am making is that the Federation of Sovereign States, known as the United States of America, surrounded, except for the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico, surrounded the Confederacy. Now, it is true that in terms of commerce, the Confederacy would control the Mississippi. And if the Confederacy fired on any shipping that was going to go south from Iowa or Illinois or Wisconsin, they would risk going to war for commercial reasons against the United States of America. On the other hand, from a commercial point of view, if the Confederacy simply charged tariffs for goods transiting the Mississippi on down to New Orleans, they could benefit their economic situation substantially without going to war. So again, whether it was the United States going to war with the Confederacy or the Confederacy going to war with the United States, the basis of the war would be commercial interests, okay? We have been sold a bill of goods that the basis of the Civil War was slavery, and from one perspective or another, our author of the video tends to agree with that. He looks at slavery from a different point of view, namely bigotry against blacks from the North, but he still is pointing to slavery as the issue. Failure of any negotiation about transit of the Mississippi would lead to war, but the major reason Northern elites stood behind, reminder, not in terms of the civilian population, but in terms of the moneyed power seats. The civilian population stood behind Lincoln's intention to go to war because Fort Sumter had been fired upon. Why did the people who paid the most taxes, who controlled the organizations, who controlled the railroads, why did they back Lincoln? And as part of that sociologic picture, I want you to be aware that Abraham Lincoln was the wealthiest lawyer in Illinois when he was elected. He rode around Illinois in a private railroad car that was donated to him by his patrons in the railroad industry. He was the wealthy man's politician of the day. I don't know what. Tammany Hall would be the comparable political equivalent. Why did they back Lincoln? They wanted to ensure hegemony and the future empire. Northern imperialism is the basic reason that the North pursued war against the Confederacy. I want you to consider a line of history going from the establishment of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, where James Monroe said to the European powers, the Western Hemisphere, boys, is ours. You stay on your side of the date line. It wasn't the date line, forgive me for that, but you get the point. In 1833, Andrew Jackson totally ignored the Supreme Court's decision that the Cherokee Nation needed to be treated as a sovereign nation and treated with as one nation state deals with another nation state. Andrew Jackson totally ignored that. He said, Supreme Court made the decision, let them enforce it. Shortly thereafter, Andrew Jackson started and his followers completed the expulsion of the Cherokee Nation from the east side of the Mississippi and kicked them over to the other side of the Mississippi, awaiting further expansion of the white man across the Mississippi. In 1846, American soldiers crossed the Nueces River, thus invading Mexican territory at the time, precipitating the Mexican War, leading to the conquest of the rest of the territory down to the Rio Grande River, and the incorporation of the Republic of Texas into the Union, the Confederacy of the United States of America. The War of Northern Aggression is on the same historic trajectory of establishing hegemony, sovereignty, control, segmentally of each and every segment of the North American continent, extending in 1898 over the Philippines and Cuba and several other protectorates. By the way, the invasion of the Philippines was a monstrous affair. We can talk about war crimes committed by the American troops in the in the Confederacy. We'd have to talk about war crimes committed by the American troops in the Philippines. You got the same trajectory that the northern capitalists were not going to let the southerners secede, primarily because that would have thrown a clinker in their plans for a sovereign country, sovereign nation state from sea to shining sea. The video that the creator of the video is really right, and I would encourage you to watch it because he has a great deal of valid information. The goal of establishing an empire, starting with a unitary nation state, is so close to the creator's worldview that he doesn't see it. I see it because I see the trajectory of the 19th century extending over into World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the destruction of Yugoslavia, and the encroachment of NATO toward Russia. You've got the same, I'm very sorry to say it, but you've got the same impetus with different generations of people. The website is what is depicted on the bottom of the screen, and I'm open to questions, comments, and argument.
It isn't the Ken Burns one, it's a different one.
No, Ken Burns, again, I'm going to express my personal opinion. Ken Burns is a perfect vassal of the American myth. As long as a movie producer produces material that is consistent with the American myth that all of us were fed, it's going to receive good notices. Ken Burns basically works for a public broadcasting system. Any Hollywood movie that is made about the military, if they want access to any military personnel or equipment, they have to get the script approved. And Johnny Got His Gun would never be approved nowadays. It's an old film about a most unfortunate victim of war who lost everything but his mind. He lost both arms, eyes. Apparently he had an orifice by which he could be fed, but he lost all ability to communicate with the outside world. And the book and the movie are about his thought processes as he laid there with the appearance of a vegetative state, but a mind that was going mad with his thought processes. So Ken Burns produces the kind of material that is going to be commercial. And one person who finances movies made the observation that a person who's going to make an anti-war movie might as well make a movie about cucumbers because it's going to get the same following. But you know what? Somewhere toward 1970, young American men, black and white, decided they didn't really want to go and start shooting at Viet Cong. And if enough of us decide that, hell no, we won't go, guess what? It's possible that they will try to throw a war and nobody will come. Which is one of the reasons I'm focusing on some of these historical events in the program. Dawn.
So I can certainly believe that the North wanted to co-opt other nations, but I have a hard time believing that the South didn't. Didn't the South have a plan to invade Mexico and take over that territory and other southern parts of this hemisphere?
Possibly. The South may have intended to gain further territory from Mexico, but they had zero hope of gaining it through the territory ceded by the Mexican cession.
Right, but they're still imperialists.
Oh, you're suggesting that perhaps the Southern Confederacy were also imperialistic?
Right.
Very possibly, very possibly. But they certainly were not imperialistic in the sense of trying to conquer the northern states. There were two occasions in which they attacked the North, and that was because Robert E. Lee was he was clearly the best military thinker of his time. And interesting that the representative of South Carolina said South Carolina was his country. That is exactly what Robert E. Lee said when Abraham Lincoln offered him the management of the Northern armies. I can't go against my country, which was Virginia. So, now, since you raised that subject, the Canadians had already decided there were other people who were very interested in the Civil War. They wanted to be sure that their side won. Great Britain was very close to declaring endorsement of and sanction of the Confederacy because they would have had access to the raw material goods of the Confederacy. They would have had the ideal commercial relationship with that section of the country. Tsarist Russia wanted to prevent, let me go back on that thought before I mention Tsarist Russia. For exactly that reason, Abraham Lincoln declared the freedom of the slaves in 1863 after the Battle of Antietam. Supposedly Antietam was a great victory for the North, and that's a peculiar way of defining victory. But the British Empire was very close to supporting the South, and once by the declaration of the Emancipation Proclamation, once Abraham Lincoln shaped or framed the war as a war for the liberation of the black man, Great Britain could no longer endorse the South. Tsarist Russia wanted to be absolutely sure that European powers didn't interfere, and therefore they put warships supporting the North in the San Francisco harbor, and I believe, but I'm not certain about this, in the New York harbor, basically telling European powers, let them settle it for themselves. So there were a lot of people with imperial interests or political interests watching very closely. So, but I don't think there's anything new about that. And the South did not have the resources to do the kinds of imperial ventures that the North eventually developed. You realize that 3 out of 4 Southerners did not have slaves at all. So the vast majority of the Southern Army were Southerners fighting because the North had invaded them, not in defense of slavery.
What about Texas being a state or being a territory and then becoming a state and things? And I've heard that is because of their wanting to have slaves, and Mexico had taken a move to abolish slavery.
They had taken, every Western country was in the process of abolishing slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And so Mexico was simply following its leader, Spain, in that regard. And it is entirely possible, but I don't have the information on it, that Texans wanted to enjoy the fruits of slavery for a while. But for the reasons I've already cited, if they did, they were on the losing side of that sociologic battle.
On an early slide, you listed some of the causes why countries go to war, and I was thinking one of those reasons that I think might have been applied but was not listed was to maintain a balance of power. In this case, you had an intractable situation. As long as you can maintain a balance of slave state versus free state, and I think it was at 13, then you can maintain some equilibrium. The South didn't feel threatened, and the North could somewhat coexist with the slavery that existed in the South. But once you start expanding them into the territories, you get the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850, and you open up those territories to slavery, then you've got yourself
You are right, but you are historically wrong.
to the threat of the balance of power.
The greatest speech that Abraham Lincoln ever gave is reported but is not recorded. And that's a speech that he gave about 1856 when he became a major figure in the Republican Party. And that is a speech where he used exactly that argument to rally his followers, that the Southerners wanted to make the Western states slave-holding states. His old line, the house divided against itself. His argument, which was purely political with no probability of coming into existence, but it was a great political argument at that time, was we've got to defend the North against the intrusion of this Southern way of thinking. But there was no there was zero, literally zero probability of slavery being extended westward beyond where it was already had been established.
Except if you're a Southerner, why should you not be entitled to that country, to that new territory, under the same laws you presently enjoy? I mean, it wasn't attractive.
Well, they knew that they were losing the political battle. The Southerners knew that with every added state, the Southern attitude towards slavery was going into was having diminished power, and the Northern attitude towards slavery was in the ascendancy. They were fully aware that they were behind the times. They were aware of that, which was one reason they wanted to get out of the Union. They wanted to get out of the Union to protect their way of doing things. And the North had the choice of forcing them back into the Union to do things the Northern way, or to simply let them be two separate states, two separate federation entities. And although I can't prove it this afternoon, I can, looking at the data, it is almost inevitable that they would have gone to war over sailing rights, transport rights on the Mississippi, or they would have gone to war for several other reasons. But those would have been subsequent wars, not a war that is claimed to liberate the slaves. In other words, it would have been a more honest war. We don't like what you're doing. We want to navigate the Mississippi. That's a war for commercial reasons, and is widely recognized as one legitimate expression of economic advancement. To wrap the Civil War in the mantle of liberating the slaves is a lie. That's the basic argument that I'm making, because the North had a choice. The North really had a choice as to whether to let the South secede or to force them back in. And the governing principle there was the Northern industrialists wanted one nation. They wanted the big guy in the block. And as I look at what the Confederacy was going to, had the prospect of becoming the only commercial advantage the Confederacy had was control of the Mississippi. So just as Alabama and Louisiana are recipients net of monies from the other states, New York and Illinois basically are supporting the federal government. They are sending more to the federal government than they are receiving back. Virtually all of the southern states receive more back than they send. They are still the sad sisters. So from a logistic or a practical point of view, I think the South failed at what it could have done, but the North failed it too. And here I'm going to quote Shelby Foote. They failed at that which the Americans are usually very good at, and that is compromise.
Well, they stitched it together for quite a while. You had the Missouri Compromise.
That's right.
1833.
That's right.
They did what they could until it became too intractable. I mean, it had to come to apparently it had to come to a point.
It had to come to a point. Beyond the point that I have made, that cloaking the War of Northern Aggression in liberation of slaves is politically and historically dishonest. One can make the very legitimate argument that a reunion of the Confederacy with the federal government was also incredibly probable. Would have taken 30 to 50 years for it to happen, and the Northern industrialists were unwilling to expend that 30 to 50 years. But if you look at the economics, if you look at where what the North was creating and what the North was selling, and what the South was creating and what the South was selling, it makes good sense to have a federation of those several states. But the Confederacy wanted to maintain their way of life, and history was really against them. They weren't going to be able to maintain slavery, whether it was the North that forced them to change, or whether it was the economics or the sociology that was going to force them to change. They were going to be forced to change. But I'm arguing that to cloak that war in the mantle of slave liberation is just dishonest.
You've covered in the past how the South was at an economic disadvantage based on tariff. Could you just explain that a little bit more?
As the South were basically sellers of raw goods and consumers of finished goods, just as India was. Okay? In that scenario, they could sell their goods, the cotton, to the north, which did not have a clothing industry until decades later, or they could sell their cotton to Great Britain, which had a milling industry. So their markets were in Great Britain. But where they were buying materials were from the north, industrial goods, or from Great Britain, industrial goods. In both cases, the South had to pay shipping charges. Less, but real shipping charges from the north, more shipping charges because it's transoceanic. In addition, the federal government imposed tariffs on anything that the South bought from Great Britain. So they were paying more for the same stuff. Britain did something of the same thing. Britain intentionally undercut their own farmers. The Corn Laws of they actually imposed about 1810 or 1815. They were totally abolished in about 1840, so that Britain's farmers had to go to town because they could no longer make a living on the farm. Why? Because Britain was buying all of its cotton at that point in time from India. And they abolished the Corn Laws precisely because they could buy cotton cheaper from India and they needed the farmers working in the factories. So the government adjusts working conditions and sales conditions all the time in order to benefit certain groups. And in the situation of Lincoln, he was clearly benefiting the industrialists of the North, because the industrialists of the North wanted to have a powerful unitary state. They did not want to have they did not want to have what South America has become. Were the Southerners unrealistic? Well, they thought they were exercising a legitimate right. And from a legal point of view, they were.
So you were saying that if they had just allowed them to split away, they would have eventually lost slavery because they couldn't support it themselves anymore.
Exactly. Slavery was sociologically out of favor, and it was becoming economically out of favor.
Yeah.
Economically, because it's a whole lot less expensive to support one worker than a worker and his grandfather and his infant child. And the slave owner could not, not only for moral reasons, but for practical reasons of motivation. A slave owner, ask yourself, is a slave going to work better for a guy who's lashing him or a guy who's feeding him and his son properly? If you have to be a slave, you'd much rather be a slave under the second case than the first case. So, and I think of my first job. I was glad to have a job for about $1.75 an hour, and I was a fairly decently motivated worker. If I had someone lashing my back, you know, I'm going to stop the sentence there. The word sabotage came from the workers in Holland who became so irritated with the way the factory owners were treating them that they took their wooden shoes and tossed them in the machinery. Their wooden shoes were called sabon, and the process of destroying the machinery was called sabotage. So people who are being abused, sooner or later, find a way of retaliating. And look at slavery from the point of view of two divided states. The Union would clearly have eliminated the Fugitive Slave Act. Slaves would have left the Confederacy in droves. They probably would have had to go up to Canada, because what the author says in the video was correct. There was tremendous hostility toward black people in the North as well as in the South. In fact, in terms of prejudice, the North was probably worse than the South, because the South was prejudiced because they were exploiting the people. And like the Israelis exploiting the Palestinians and stealing their land, the Israelis dislike the Palestinians a whole lot more than the Palestinians dislike the Israelis. Palestinians want to live in peace and equality. The Israelis want to feel good about exploiting the Palestinians. Thank you. You've been a very attentive audience, and I like your questions and comments.